June 24th, 1314. The sun rises over a narrow, boggy plain near Stirling, Scotland. Mist clings to the ground like a shroud. On one side, roughly 6,000 exhausted Scots, most of them farmers and common soldiers armed with spears. On the other, 20,000 English invaders, the largest, most powerful army in Europe, bristling with heavily armored knights, the finest cavalry in Christendom. What happened in the next 12 hours would shatter one of the greatest military machines the world had ever seen and forge a nation that refused to die. This is the story of Bannockburn, the battle that saved Scotland. Before we go any further, if this kind of content is what you're here for, real history, no fluff, just the facts, the decisions, and the consequences, hit that like button and drop a comment. It helps more than you know. Now, let's go back 28 years to understand how Scotland ended up on the edge of total annihilation. Scotland in 1286 was not the romantic Highland kingdom of legend. It was a prosperous, stable realm under Alexander III, a king who had brought peace and relative wealth to his people. But on March 19, 1286, everything changed. Alexander was riding at night along the cliffs of Fife, returning to his new wife. The weather was terrible, wind, rain, darkness. His horse stumbled. Alexander fell. By morning, the King of Scotland was dead on the rocks below, his neck broken. He left no surviving sons. His only heir was his 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, living in a foreign court. Scotland had no adult monarch, no clear succession, and suddenly, the kingdom was vulnerable. The Scottish nobles appointed 6 guardians to rule until Margaret came of age. But in 1290, Margaret died on the voyage from Norway to Scotland. She never set foot in the kingdom she was meant to inherit. Scotland was plunged into chaos. There was no obvious heir. By some counts, 13 different men had competing claims to the throne. This period became known as the Great Cause, the crisis of succession that would consume Scotland for a generation. The Scottish magnates, desperate to avoid civil war, made a fateful decision. They invited Edward I of England to act as neutral arbitrator. Edward, known as the Hammer of the Scots, was one of the most formidable kings Europe had ever produced. Warrior, legislator, empire builder. But neutral. Never. Edward agreed to judge the claims, but only on one condition. Every claimant had to publicly recognize him as the Lord Paramount of Scotland, essentially, overlord. The Scots, divided and desperate, agreed. It was a trap. In 1292, Edward chose John Balliol as king. Balliol had a strong claim, but more importantly, Edward thought he could control him. For the next few years, Balliol was systematically humiliated. Edward summoned him to English courts like a vassal. He overruled his decisions. He demanded Scottish troops for English wars. The Scots called Balliol Tomb Tabard, the empty coat. A king in name only. By 1296, the humiliation was too much. The Scottish nobles forced Balliol to renounce his allegiance to Edward and sign a treaty with France instead. This was the beginning of the Auld Alliance, the centuries-long partnership between Scotland and France against England. Edward's response was swift and merciless. He marched north with an army and sacked the prosperous town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. What happened next was one of the first great war crimes of the conflict. English soldiers slaughtered the townspeople, men, women, children. Contemporary chronicles say the killing went on for days. The gutters ran red. Edward wanted to send a message. Scotland would submit or burn. He swept through Scotland, defeated Balliol's forces at Dunbar, and stripped Balliol of his crown. The humiliated king was taken prisoner and eventually exiled to France. Edward seized the Stone of Scone, the ancient symbol of Scottish kingship, and took it to Westminster. Scotland, Edward declared, no longer existed as an independent kingdom. It was now a province of England, to be ruled by English officials and English law. But Scotland did not accept this. In 1297, resistance exploded across the country. The most famous leader was William Wallace, a minor noble turned guerrilla fighter. Alongside Andrew Murray, Wallace led a devastating campaign against English occupation forces. At Stirling Bridge in September 1297, Wallace and Murray achieved the impossible. They lured a massive English army onto a narrow bridge over the River Forth and slaughtered them as they crossed. The English commander, John de Warenne, fled. Scotland was suddenly, shockingly, free again. Wallace was appointed guardian of Scotland. For a few brief months, it seemed like the impossible had happened. But Edward I was not a man who accepted defeat. In 1298, he returned with a professional army and crushed Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk. The Scottish schiltrons, formations of spearmen, held against the English cavalry, but Edward's longbowmen tore them apart. Wallace survived, but his army was destroyed. He resigned as guardian and went into hiding, continuing a guerrilla campaign for years. In 1305, Wallace was betrayed, captured, and dragged to London. Edward staged a show trial. Wallace was charged with treason, a charge he rejected, arguing he had never sworn allegiance to Edward in the first place. It didn't matter. He was convicted. The punishment was designed to break Scotland's spirit. Wallace was hanged, cut down while still alive, disemboweled, castrated, beheaded, and quartered. His head was placed on a spike on London Bridge. His limbs were sent to 4 corners of Scotland as a warning. This is what happens to rebels. But instead of breaking Scotland, Edward had created a martyr. And into the chaos stepped Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, grandson of one of the original claimants to the throne. Bruce was a complicated man. He had fought for the English. He had fought against them. His family's claim to the throne was strong, but so was John Comyn's, his rival. In February 1306, Bruce met Comyn in the Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, supposedly to negotiate. Instead, Bruce stabbed him. Whether it was premeditated murder or a fight that went too far, no one knows. But the result was the same. Comyn died on the altar steps. Bruce had committed sacrilege and murder. The Pope excommunicated him. Scotland's nobility was divided. But Bruce had made his choice. 6 weeks later, he crowned himself King of Scotland. It was the worst possible start to a reign. Edward I was still alive and furious. Bruce had almost no support. Within months, his tiny army was crushed at the Battle of Methven. His wife, daughter, and sisters were captured. Edward, in a move that shocked even his own contemporaries, had Bruce's women imprisoned in cages. Wooden and iron cages hung from castle walls, exposed to the elements, for years. Bruce's brothers were executed. Bruce himself became a fugitive, hunted across Scotland, hiding in the Highlands and Islands with a handful of loyal men. This was the lowest point. Bruce, a king with no kingdom, no army, no hope. The story goes that during this time, hiding in a cave, Bruce watched a spider trying again and again to spin a web, failing, trying again, and finally succeeding. Whether the story is true or legend, it captures the moment. Bruce decided to try again. Then, in 1307, everything changed. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, died during yet another campaign against Scotland. His son, Edward II, was nothing like his father. Weak, indecisive, more interested in his favorites than in war. Bruce seized the opportunity. He launched a guerrilla campaign across Scotland, defeating his enemies one by one, dismantling English strongholds. At the Battle of Loudon Hill in 1307, Bruce used terrain and tactics to defeat a much larger English force. It was his first major victory, and it announced to Scotland that Robert Bruce was not just a desperate fugitive, he was a king who could win. Over the next 6 years, Bruce fought a slow, grinding war of liberation. He didn't just defeat the English. He destroyed Scottish nobles who opposed him, the MacDougalls, the Comyns. He didn't hold castles, he tore them down so the English couldn't use them. By 1313, almost all of Scotland was free. Only a handful of English garrisons remained. The most important was Stirling Castle. Stirling Castle sat on a volcanic rock overlooking the River Forth, the gateway to the Scottish Highlands. It was the most strategically vital fortress in Scotland. Whoever held Stirling controlled Scotland. In 1313, Robert Bruce's younger brother, Edward Bruce, laid siege to it. Edward was brave, reckless, and impulsive, everything his older brother was not. The English commander, Philip Mowbray, knew relief was unlikely. So Edward Bruce made a deal. If the English did not relieve Stirling by midsummer 1314, Mowbray would surrender the castle. It was a catastrophic mistake. Robert Bruce was furious when he heard. The deal forced Edward to's hand. If Edward did nothing, he would lose Stirling and with it, any claim to Scotland. He had no choice but to march north with the largest army he could raise. Edward Bruce's recklessness had just forced the showdown Robert had been trying to avoid. Scotland would have to face the full might of England in open battle. Edward II began assembling his army in the spring of 1314. This was not a raiding party. This was an invasion force designed to crush Scotland once and for all. The exact size is debated by historians. Medieval chronicles often exaggerate numbers wildly. The most reliable modern estimates put the English force at around 20,000 men. That included roughly 2,500 to 3,000 heavy cavalry, knights and men-at-arms in full armor, the shock troops of medieval warfare. The rest were infantry, including thousands of longbowmen from Wales and England, and spearmen. It was the largest English army assembled in a generation. Against this, Robert Bruce could field perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 men. Most were spearmen, common soldiers armed with 12-foot pikes. Bruce had maybe 500 light cavalry, mostly mounted scouts and raiders, not heavily armored knights. In a straight fight, in open terrain, the English would annihilate them. Bruce knew this. So he didn't plan a straight fight. The English army marched north in June, moving slowly due to its size. Supply was a nightmare. Edward's scorched earth tactics during previous invasions meant there was little food to forage. The weather was hot. Morale was mixed. Many of the soldiers were there because they had to be, not because they wanted to fight in Scotland again. But the army was still massive, and it was moving towards Stirling. Robert Bruce had been preparing for this moment for months. He chose his ground carefully. Just south of Stirling, near a place called Bannockburn, the terrain was treacherous. To the east was the Bannockburn itself, a steep-sided stream. To the north was the Pell-stream burn. Between them was low, marshy ground called the Carse. The only good approach was a narrow stretch of firm ground called the New Park, an old royal hunting forest. Bruce positioned his army there, and ordered his men to dig. They dug pits across the approach routes, small holes, covered with branches and turf, designed to break the legs of charging horses. They dug trenches. They turned the New Park into a killing ground. Bruce also drilled his men relentlessly in the schiltron formation. A schiltron was a densely packed circle or square of spearmen, pikes pointing outward in every direction, like a giant hedgehog. If the formation held, cavalry couldn't break it. If it wavered, the horsemen would cut them to pieces. Everything depended on discipline. Bruce divided his army into 4 divisions. He commanded one personally. His brother Edward led another. James Douglas, his most trusted captain, led a third. Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, led the 4th. Each division was a schiltron of around 1,500 to 2,000 men. They trained together, ate together, and prayed together. By the time the English arrived, they were ready. On June 23, 1314, the English vanguard reached Bannockburn. The main army was still strung out along the road, but the advance force, led by the Earls of Gloucester and Hereford, pushed ahead. Their goal was to relieve Stirling Castle before the deadline expired at midnight. Philip Mowbray, the English commander inside the castle, sent word that the terms of the truce had technically been met. An English army had arrived. He urged Edward II not to attack immediately, to rest his men, to wait. Edward ignored him. Part of the English vanguard, commanded by Sir Robert Clifford and Sir Henry Beaumont, tried to skirt around Bruce's position and reach the castle directly. Bruce spotted them and ordered Thomas Randolph to intercept. Randolph hesitated. His schiltron would be exposed in open ground, vulnerable. Bruce, watching from a distance, was furious. According to chroniclers, he shouted at Randolph, "A rose has fallen from your chaplet." In other words, you've just lost your honor. You've just lost Scotland. Randolph, stung, led his 500 men straight toward Clifford's cavalry. It should have been suicide. 300 English knights in full armor charged the Scottish spearmen. But Randolph's schiltron held. The horses couldn't break the wall of pikes. The knights circled, charged again, and again. Men and horses died impaled on Scottish spears. After brutal, desperate fighting, the English cavalry broke and fled. Randolph had done the impossible. He had defeated heavy cavalry in open ground. Meanwhile, at the new park, the main English vanguard was probing Bruce's lines. And then, something extraordinary happened. A young English knight, Sir Henry de Bohun, nephew of the Earl of Hereford, spotted Robert Bruce riding in front of the Scottish lines. Bruce was mounted, but only lightly armored, armed with a battle-axe. De Bohun, fully armored and on a warhorse, saw his chance for immortal glory. He lowered his lance and charged. Bruce didn't retreat. He didn't call for help. He waited. At the last second, he swerved his smaller horse to the side, rose in his stirrups, and brought his axe down on de Bohun's helmeted head with such force that the axe shattered. De Bohun fell dead from his horse. The Scottish army erupted in cheers. The English were stunned. Their king had just killed an English knight in single combat in front of both armies. Bruce's captains were furious with him for taking such a risk. Bruce, looking at his broken axe, reportedly said, "I have broken my good axe." It was a defining moment. The English had seen their enemy's king face them personally, fearlessly. The Scots had seen their leader prove he would fight alongside them. That night, the English army camped in the low ground between the burns, exhausted, disorganized, and increasingly demoralized. They had expected to sweep the Scots aside. Instead, they had lost 2 skirmishes and seen their vanguard humiliated. The Scots, camped in the new park, sang psalms and prepared for the next day. Bruce held a council. Some of his commanders urged retreat. The English were still vastly superior in numbers. Why risk everything in a single battle? Bruce refused. He had chosen this ground. He had prepared his men. If they ran now, Scotland would never be free. June 24, 1314. Dawn broke over the field at Bannockburn. The Scottish army formed up in their schiltrons and began to advance slowly down the slope toward the English position. Then they did something that shocked the English. They knelt. Every man, in unison, knelt in prayer. Edward II, watching from a distance, turned to one of his commanders and said, "They kneel for mercy." The commander, who knew the Scots better, replied, "They kneel for mercy, yes. But not from you. From God. Those men will win or die." Bruce gave his final speech. We don't know his exact words, but later tradition preserved the spirit of it in the Scots Wha, the great patriotic poem by Robert Burns. "Scots who have with Wallace bled, Scots, whom Bruce has often led, welcome to your gory bed, or to victory." Whether Bruce said those words or not, the message was clear. This was the moment. Everything Scotland had endured, the humiliation, the occupation, the executions, the years of guerrilla war, it all came down to this. Win here, or lose everything. The English army, trapped in the marshy ground between the 2 burns, tried to deploy. But there wasn't enough room. 20,000 men crammed into a space barely wide enough for half that number. The cavalry, which should have been their decisive weapon, couldn't maneuver. The infantry couldn't form proper lines. The longbowmen, who had won Falkirk, were blocked by their own knights. It was chaos. The Scottish schiltrons advanced. Slowly, steadily, a moving wall of spears. The English heavy cavalry, the finest in Europe, charged. They hit the schiltron like a hammer striking an anvil. Horses impaled themselves on the pikes. Knights were dragged from their saddles. The schiltron bent but didn't break. The English charged again. And again. Each time, more men died, more horses screamed and fell. The ground became a slaughterhouse. The English cavalry, bred and trained for shock charges in open fields, found themselves in a nightmare. They couldn't maneuver. The marshy ground sucked at their horses' hooves. The narrow space between the burns meant they couldn't spread out, couldn't flank, couldn't use their numbers. And the Scottish schiltrons kept coming. Not fast. Not charging. Just advancing, step by step, an implacable wall of 12-foot spears. The Earl of Gloucester, one of Edward's most senior commanders, led a desperate charge straight into the Scottish centre. He was trying to break Bruce's own division. Gloucester was brave, experienced, and determined. He was also doomed. His horse was impaled. He was dragged from the saddle and killed in the press of bodies. His death sent a shockwave through the English ranks. If a man like Gloucester could die so quickly, what hope did anyone else have? The English longbowmen, who had devastated Scottish infantry at Falkirk 16 years earlier, finally managed to get into position and began shooting. Arrows started falling into the Scottish ranks. Men screamed and fell. For a moment, it looked like the tide might turn. But Bruce had anticipated this. He unleashed his small force of light cavalry, maybe 500 men under Sir Robert Keith, the Marischal of Scotland. They weren't heavy knights. They couldn't fight in a melee. But they could scatter archers. Keith's horsemen smashed into the English bowmen, who had no protection, no time to form defensive positions. The archers broke and ran. The arrow storm stopped. Now it was just infantry and exhausted cavalry trapped in the killing ground. The Scottish schiltrons tightened their formation and kept pushing. The English line, if you could even call it a line, began to compress. Men at the back were pushing forward, trying to get into the fight. Men at the front were trying to retreat, to get away from the spears. In the crush, knights in full armor couldn't lift their weapons. Soldiers suffocated standing up. Horses panicked and trampled their own riders. And then the Scots saw something that changed everything. On a hill to the west, a mass of people appeared. Thousands of them, moving toward the battlefield. These were the small folk, camp followers, servants, grooms, baggage handlers who had been left behind in the Scottish camp. They weren't soldiers. Most weren't even armed. But they saw what was happening. They saw the English trapped and dying. And they wanted in. They grabbed whatever they could, sticks, knives, banners on poles, and came pouring down the hill, screaming. The English, already on the edge of panic, saw what looked like another Scottish army arriving. They didn't know these were just camp followers. They saw thousands more enemies and broke. Not slowly. Not in stages. All at once. The entire English army disintegrated. Men ran. Knights abandoned their horses. Infantry threw down their weapons. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. The only escape routes were across the burns, steep-sided streams that were already difficult to cross. Now, with thousands of men trying to force their way across at the same time, they became death traps. Men in armor fell into the water and drowned. Others were trampled. The Bannockburn, which had been a trickle that morning, was choked with English dead. Edward II, watching the disaster unfold, refused to leave. His bodyguard literally had to drag him away from the field. One knight grabbed the king's reins and shouted, "Sire, will you flee?" Edward, in shock, replied, "I will not die here." They rode hard for Stirling Castle, thinking it was a refuge. But Philip Mowbray, the English commander inside, met them at the gate and told Edward the brutal truth. The castle was about to surrender. If Edward stayed, he would be captured. Mowbray pointed east and told the king to ride for the border as fast as his horse could carry him. Edward fled. The King of England, the man who had come north to crush Scotland forever, abandoned his army and ran for his life. He made it to Dunbar and then sailed south by ship. Behind him, his army was being hunted and slaughtered. The Scots gave no quarter. This was payback for Berwick, for Falkirk, for every atrocity the English had committed in Scotland over the past 18 years. Scottish soldiers waded into the burns and killed men as they tried to crawl out. Nobles were taken prisoner for ransom, but common soldiers were cut down where they stood. By the end of the day, the English had lost somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 men. Historians still argue over the exact number. The Scots lost maybe 500. It wasn't a battle. It was an annihilation. Among the English dead were the Earl of Gloucester, dozens of knights and barons, and hundreds of men-at-arms. Among the captured were the Earl of Hereford, one of the most powerful men in England, along with many other high-ranking nobles. The plunder was staggering. The English had brought everything: baggage trains, treasure, supplies, the royal wardrobe, even Edward II's personal seal. All of it fell into Scottish hands. The gold and silver alone funded Bruce's government for years. The English seal, which Edward used to authenticate royal documents, became a humiliating trophy. Edward had to have a new one made and send letters across Europe explaining why his official documents now carried a different seal. The political damage was almost as devastating as the military defeat. Stirling Castle surrendered the next day. Scotland was free. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, there was no English army occupying Scottish soil. Robert Bruce, the excommunicated murderer who had crowned himself in desperation 8 years earlier, was now unquestionably the King of Scots. But the war wasn't over. Edward II refused to accept defeat. He refused to recognize Bruce as king. He refused to make peace. For the next 14 years, the conflict dragged on. Bruce launched devastating raids into northern England, burning towns, taking ransom, spreading terror. The English called it the Great Raid. The Scots called it justice. Bruce even invaded Ireland, trying to open a second front and link up with Irish rebels. It didn't work, and Edward Bruce was killed there in 1318, but it kept the English off balance. In 1320, the Scottish nobles and clergy sent a letter to the Pope. It became known as the Declaration of Arbroath, and it is one of the most important documents in Scottish history. It's not just a political statement. It's a manifesto of national identity. Let me read you part of it. For as long as 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be subjected to the lordship of the English. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. That line, for freedom alone, would echo through Scottish culture for centuries. It told the Pope and the world that Scotland was not a rebellious province. It was a nation, and it would rather die than submit. The Pope, caught between English pressure and Scottish defiance, didn't formally recognize Bruce, but he stopped calling him a rebel. It was progress. Bannockburn didn't just save Scotland. It changed the nature of medieval warfare. For centuries, the dominant force on European battlefields had been heavy cavalry, armored knights charging at full speed. Infantry were considered almost expendable. But at Bannockburn, disciplined infantry with long spears had destroyed the finest cavalry in Europe. Other commanders took note. The Swiss would use similar tactics with devastating effect in the next century. The Flemish had already done it at Courtrai in 1302. But Bannockburn was the most dramatic, most complete example. Cavalry was no longer invincible. In England, the defeat triggered a political crisis. Edward II's authority, already weak, collapsed. His barons turned on him. His favorites were murdered. By 1327, Edward was deposed by his own wife and her lover, Roger Mortimer, and imprisoned. He died in captivity, probably murdered. His teenage son, Edward III, became king. And finally, in 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was signed. England recognized Robert Bruce as King of Scots. Scotland was acknowledged as an independent kingdom. The war, at least officially, was over. Bruce didn't have long to enjoy his victory. He was already sick, probably with leprosy, though historians debate the diagnosis. He died on June 7, 1329, just 1 year after the treaty. He was 54 years old. On his deathbed, he made one final request. He had been excommunicated for murdering Comyn in a church. He wanted to atone. He asked that after his death, his heart be taken from his body and carried on crusade to the Holy Land. His loyal friend, James Douglas, agreed to do it. Douglas never made it to Jerusalem. He got as far as Spain, where he joined a campaign against the Moors. In the middle of a battle surrounded by enemies, Douglas reportedly took Bruce's heart from the silver casket he carried and threw it into the enemy ranks, shouting, "Lead on, brave heart, as you have always done, and Douglas will follow you or die." He died moments later. Bruce's heart was recovered and brought back to Scotland, where it was buried at Melrose Abbey. His body was buried at Dunfermline. The heart and the body, separated, just like the man, half warrior, half king. The war didn't end with Bruce's death. It couldn't. Edward III, once he came of age and took real power, had no intention of honoring his father's treaty. In 1332, just 3 years after Bruce died, the English invaded again. Bruce's son, David II, was only 5 years old. The Second War of Scottish Independence dragged on for another 30 years. Scotland would be invaded, occupied, liberated, and invaded again. The cycle of violence that had begun in 1296 would not fully end until the late 14th century. But Bannockburn remained the turning point. It proved that Scotland could win. That a smaller, poorer nation could defeat a much larger empire if it fought smart, used the terrain, stayed disciplined, and refused to give up. The memory of that day, June 24, 1314, became part of the Scottish soul. Generations of Scots grew up hearing the story. The king who fought back from nothing. The army of farmers who stood against knights. The battle that should have been a massacre but became a miracle. The impact of Bannockburn on English politics cannot be overstated. Edward II's defeat shattered his credibility. His reign, which had started with such promise, descended into chaos. His barons despised him. His wife betrayed him. The loss at Bannockburn was the proximate cause of England's civil war in the 1320s. England's internal divisions gave Scotland the breathing room it desperately needed. If Edward II had been a strong king, if he had kept his nobility united, Scotland might not have survived. But he wasn't, and Scotland did. Bannockburn also had a cultural legacy that lasted far beyond the medieval period. In the 18th century, Scotland was absorbed into the United Kingdom through the Act of Union in 1707. For many Scots, this felt like a betrayal of everything their ancestors had fought for. Bannockburn became a rallying cry for Scottish identity in a time when that identity was under threat. The poet Robert Burns, Scotland's national bard, wrote Scots Wha Hae in 1793, explicitly linking it to Bruce's speech before Bannockburn. It became an unofficial national anthem. In the 19th century, the battlefield itself became a pilgrimage site. Monuments were erected. Societies were formed to preserve the memory. The Bannockburn Heritage Center was eventually built. Today, thousands of people visit the site every year. They walk the ground where the schiltron stood. They look out over the carse where the English army was trapped. And even now, 700 years later, the weight of what happened there is palpable. Let's talk about what made Bannockburn so decisive, because it wasn't just luck. Robert Bruce won that battle before the first spear was raised. He won it by choosing the ground. Medieval commanders understood terrain, but Bruce understood it at a level that few of his contemporaries could match. He had spent years fighting a guerrilla war. He knew that in open ground, heavy cavalry would destroy his spearmen. So he forced the English into ground where cavalry was useless. The marshy carse between the burns was a deliberate trap. The pits and obstacles in the new park were calculated defenses. Bruce even used the time of year to his advantage. Midsummer, when the burns were low but the ground was still soft enough to bog down horses. He understood logistics, too. The English army was enormous, which meant it needed enormous supplies. By forcing Edward to march quickly to meet the Stirling deadline, Bruce ensured the English would arrive exhausted, undersupplied, and stretched thin. Bruce also understood morale. His army was smaller, but every man in it had a reason to fight. They were defending their homes. They had suffered under English occupation. Many had lost family members to English violence. They weren't there for pay or feudal obligation. They were there because Scotland's survival depended on them. That kind of motivation is a weapon in itself. The schiltron formation was another key factor. It wasn't a new invention, the Scots had used it at Falkirk in 1298. But Bruce refined it. He drilled his men relentlessly. He made sure they could move in formation, not just stand still. A static schiltron could be surrounded and destroyed. But a schiltron that could advance, that could attack, was something different. It became a mobile fortress. At Bannockburn, the Scots didn't just hold their ground. They pushed forward, step by step, compressing the English into an ever smaller space until there was nowhere left to go. And then there was Bruce himself. Leadership matters. Wallace had been a brilliant guerrilla fighter, but he couldn't unite Scotland's nobility. Bruce was nobility. He had the legitimacy, the political skill, and the sheer charisma to bring the kingdom together. He was also willing to take insane personal risks, like fighting Henry de Bohun in single combat the day before the battle. That moment electrified his army. It told them their king wasn't commanding from a safe distance. He was right there with them, willing to die if necessary. Compare that to Edward II. Edward was miles behind his army when the battle started. He didn't lead charges. He didn't inspire his men. And when the battle turned, he fled. That's not a judgment on his personal courage. Medieval kings were expected to survive, to preserve the monarchy. But in terms of morale, the contrast was devastating. The Scots saw their king kill an English knight with an axe. The English saw their king run away. The aftermath of Bannockburn shaped Scotland for generations. The ransom money from captured English nobles funded the Scottish government and military for years. The destruction of the English army meant Scotland had breathing room to rebuild. Castles were repaired. Trade resumed. The country, which had been bled dry by 2 decades of war, began to recover. But the psychological impact was even more important. Before Bannockburn, Scottish independence was a dream. After Bannockburn, it was a reality. The battle didn't just defeat an army. It defeated the idea that Scotland couldn't survive as an independent nation. It proved that England, for all its wealth and power, could be beaten. That lesson would be remembered every time England invaded again, and England would invade again and again over the next 3 centuries. Bannockburn also established the model for Scottish resistance. Use the terrain. Avoid open battle unless you have the advantage. Fight smart, not fair. Hit and run. Bleed the enemy. Make occupation so costly that it's not worth it. These weren't just medieval tactics. They became the core of Scottish military doctrine. And they worked. Scotland remained independent until 1707, and even then, it was absorbed through political union, not military conquest. Let's also talk about the individual stories, because wars are fought by people, not abstractions. Take Thomas Randolph, the man who almost lost Scotland by hesitating and then saved it by attacking 300 knights with 500 spearmen. Randolph had been captured by the English early in the war. He had even fought for them for a while. But Bruce won him back, and Randolph became one of his most loyal commanders. At Bannockburn, he proved his worth. After Bruce's death, Randolph served as guardian of Scotland during David II's childhood. He was one of the key figures who kept the kingdom together. James Douglas, the Black Douglas, was another legend. Younger son of a noble family, dispossessed by the English, Douglas became Bruce's most effective raider. He terrorized the English border for years. At Bannockburn, he commanded one of the schiltrons with brutal efficiency. After Bruce's death, Douglas carried the king's heart on crusade and died in battle in Spain. His name became synonymous with Scottish ferocity. English mothers would tell their children, "Hush, or the Black Douglas will get you." Edward Bruce, Robert's younger brother, was brave to the point of recklessness. His impulsive deal with Mowbray forced the Battle of Bannockburn in the first place. At Bannockburn, he commanded one of the 4 divisions and fought with typical ferocity. But his recklessness eventually killed him. In 1318, during the Scottish invasion of Ireland, Edward led a charge against overwhelming odds and was cut down. His death effectively ended Scotland's Irish ambitions. And then there's Robert Bruce himself. Complicated, ruthless, brilliant. A man who murdered a rival in a church and then spent the rest of his life trying to atone for it. A king who was excommunicated, hunted, defeated again and again, and who kept coming back. Bruce understood that kingship wasn't just about bloodlines or crowns. It was about winning. About survival. About refusing to quit. By the time he died, he had done what every expert said was impossible. He had beaten England. He had secured Scotland's independence. He had won. Bannockburn's legacy in warfare extended far beyond Scotland. Military historians point to it as a key moment in the decline of feudal cavalry dominance. For centuries, the knight, armored, mounted, trained from childhood, had been the ultimate weapon. But Bannockburn, along with battles like Courtrai and later Crécy and Agincourt, proved that infantry, if well trained and well led, could defeat cavalry. The age of the knight was ending. The age of disciplined infantry formations was beginning. The Swiss took this lesson and perfected it. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Swiss pike formations became the most feared infantry in Europe. They used tactics strikingly similar to the Scottish schiltron, dense squares of men with long pikes, capable of both defense and aggressive attack. The Swiss sold their services as mercenaries and dominated European battlefields for over a century. They learned from the Scots, and the Scots had learned from necessity. The English learned a different lesson. After Bannockburn, English military strategy shifted. They realized that heavy cavalry charges into prepared infantry were suicidal. Instead, they developed combined arms tactics, using longbowmen to break up enemy formations from a distance, and then sending in cavalry and infantry to finish the job. This approach would devastate the French at Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415. In a way, Bannockburn taught the English how to become one of the most effective military powers in Europe. Just not in time to conquer Scotland. The Scottish Wars of Independence also had a profound impact on English and Scottish national identity. For England, the repeated failures to subdue Scotland were a source of deep frustration. For Scotland, the wars became a foundational myth, the story of a small nation that refused to be conquered. The Declaration of Arbroath, with its ringing defense of freedom, became a sacred text. It was quoted during the Scottish Reformation, during debates over the Act of Union, and even in modern arguments for Scottish independence. In the 20th century, Bannockburn took on new political significance. In the 1930s, as Scottish nationalism began to grow, the battle became a symbol of resistance to English domination. In 1964, the 650th anniversary of the battle, a massive monument was unveiled at the site. In 2014, the 700th anniversary, the battlefield was completely redesigned with a new visitor center and immersive exhibits. The Scottish independence referendum was held just months later. The symbolism was impossible to miss. But let's be clear about something. Bannockburn didn't end English attempts to control Scotland. Edward III invaded in the 1330s. Henry VIII launched brutal invasions in the 1540s, a period known as the Rough Wooing. Cromwell's armies crushed Scotland in the 1650s. The Jacobite risings of the 18th century were, in part, Scottish attempts to resist English political control. The struggle that began in 1296 echoed for centuries. And yet, Scotland survived. Not always victorious, not always united, but never fully conquered. That resilience, that refusal to disappear, traces back to Bannockburn. The battle gave Scotland a victory so complete, so shocking, that it became proof of possibility. No matter how many times Scotland was invaded, occupied, or betrayed, the memory of Bannockburn remained. A reminder that the impossible could happen. Let's also acknowledge the cost. Wars like this don't have clean victories. Thousands of men died at Bannockburn, Scottish as well as English. Thousands more died in the decades of war that followed. Villages were burned. Crops were destroyed. Families were shattered. The Anglo-Scottish border became one of the most violent, lawless regions in Europe for 3 centuries. The legacy of Bannockburn wasn't just national pride. It was also centuries of bloodshed. Robert Bruce himself was a deeply flawed man. He murdered a rival in a church. He executed opponents. He waged total war, burning English towns and taking hostages. He was excommunicated by the Pope and spent years as an outlaw. But he was also a man who, when everything was lost, decided to fight back. Who turned guerrilla warfare into an art form. Who understood that wars are won in the mind as much as on the battlefield. Who gave Scotland a chance when no one else could. The battle itself lasted only a few hours. But those hours changed the course of history. If the English had won at Bannockburn, Scotland would have ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. It would have been absorbed into England, just as Wales had been. Scottish culture, language, and identity would have been suppressed. There would be no separate Scottish legal system, no Church of Scotland, no distinct Scottish identity within the United Kingdom. Scotland would have become a northern province, like Yorkshire or Cornwall. But the English didn't win. Robert Bruce, with 6,000 exhausted soldiers, most of them farmers and tradesmen, defeated the greatest army in Europe. They did it with discipline, with terrain, with tactics, and with sheer bloody-minded refusal to give up. And in doing so, they saved a nation. 7 centuries later, on those same fields near Stirling, you can still feel it. The weight of what happened there. The desperation, the violence, the impossible victory. Stand on the spot where the schiltrons advanced, where the English cavalry charged and broke, where thousands of men fought and died in the span of a single morning. Close your eyes and you can almost hear it. The roar of voices, the clash of steel, the screams of horses, the thunder of 20,000 men trying to kill each other in a space barely a mile wide. And then silence. The battle over. The English fleeing. Scotland free. Bannockburn wasn't just a military victory. It was a statement. A declaration that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the odds. That freedom isn't given, it's taken. That nations are born not in palaces or parliaments, but in moments when ordinary people decide they've had enough and refuse to back down. Robert Bruce and his 6,000 soldiers didn't just win a battle that day. They won the right to exist. They won Scotland. And they proved, once and for all, that no empire, no matter how powerful, is invincible. If you made it this far, if this story moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Because stories like this, stories of impossible victories and nations that refuse to die, these are the stories that matter. These are the stories that remind us what's possible. This is history. Not the sanitized, boring version they teach in schools. This is the real thing. Blood, mud, terror, and triumph. This is what it actually cost to build the world we live in. And this is why we remember Bannockburn. Not because it was clean or easy, but because it was necessary. Because 6,000 men looked at 20,000 and said, "We're not running." 700 years later, on those same fields, you can still feel it. The day a small nation looked the greatest empire in Europe in the eye and refused to blink.